Francis of the Filth. Chapter 5. It was like so, but wasn't. Frank came to, but didn't. He was conscious, but sort that might accompany an out-of-body experience or an animated suspension. The first thing he perceived was that he was floating through an entirely new dimension, one of previously unknown physical qualities. He was free of gravity and completely weightless. His skin tingled as though he were being lightly caressed all over. The light around him was distorted in an otherworldly way and made everything look soft and beautiful. Pretty shadows and reflected lights danced around him. Time ceased to exist and a beautiful silence encapsulated him. For Frank, it was a rare, beautiful moment, shattered only by the realization that he was floating face down in a swamp and about to choke. He rose from the waters, coughing and spluttering and retching and crying. He needed a few moments to regain full awareness, and when he did, misery was there, with a comprehension that traveling between realms was like death and rebirth each time. He sat in the shallow water amidst a vast forest of mangroves. Strips of seaweed fluttered in slow motion under the water, tickling calves and wrapping around his toes. Small fish darted under and out of the roots of the trees. Occasionally, flat creatures with gill slits that looked like stab wounds would hover over the sandy bed and slowly move away when Frank tried to kick them. Frank was relieved to find familiar ecosystems in other realms. He stood to look about over the branches of the trees. The mangrove forest around him extended to the horizon in all directions but one. Above him was a sunless sky that sat hot and heavy like a bronze dome. Bat-like birds flew above and through the trees, which were infested with all manner of insects, spiders, and giant winged arthropods. Pale, flaky-skinned snakes slithered quietly along branches and across the surface of the water. To Frank, this place was eerily like the jungles of Okinawa on a bad day, and moving through it brought bitter memories and an ominous sense that worse was to come. Pink Guy was nowhere to be seen. Frank didn't want to bring attention to himself, so calling him was out of the question. The logical thing was to move in the only direction that didn't lead to more mangroves. In that line, above the forest, was a cluster of golden, rather picturesque foothills, which skirted an enormous pointed mountain. It rose up and almost touched the rusty sky. The water he was wading through was never deeper than his waist, so his only real challenge was avoiding the fauna, half of which scattered in fear as he approached, and half of which moved toward him in the hope of enjoying a warm meal. The last region of the mangrove was ankle deep, so Frank made a quick progress towards the amber fields. Just short of the shoreline, he stopped and listened carefully. An odd sound could be heard from nearby, but then ceased. Frank waited patiently, listening and peering. He could see nothing. He had hoped that it might be Pink Guy. The sound came again, like a beast prancing on the spot in the muddy waters. Frank moved more closely toward it, trying to keep his sodden footsteps as quiet as possible. Again the sound came, wild and moist, through the low-lying trees. It was near now, a ferocious and juicy sound, and Frank felt a fresh nausea rise up within him. Peering through a leafy scrub on his left, he saw a white creature with a bulbous yellow head, devouring the intestines of a still conscious beast, kicking in the shallow waters. Though the creature seemed skittish, it didn't notice Frank watching him from behind. He moved around in a large circle to come into the creature's view, and when he saw Frank, he jumped out and let out a hideous cry.
Oh, God! I'm 11!
It was an apt introduction. This creature looked like a warty atop a thin radish. Frank kept his distance as the two sized each other up.
Oh, God! I'm 11!
The creature yelled again. Frank quickly assumed that debating might not be this thing's strong point.
I'm Frank.
Frank called back with a friendly wave.
I'm 11!
He heard again.
Yeah, I got that,
said Frank before quietly mumbling.
I'm in the land of morons. Oh, God! I'm 11!
It called again, slowly approaching Frank.
Well, you know what they say about when you get stuck with a lemon.
Frank chuckled.
I'm 11!
He was becoming more agitated as he spoke, his voice rising with each profession. Frank began to sense that this creature might actually be a complex soul imprisoned in its lemony shell. As he drew nearer, Frank got a better look at his counterpart. He had an enormous yellow head, like a lemon on its side. Some lemons have a beautiful symmetry to them. This one did not. It was bulgy and lopsided and covered with pocks and warts. Pure ugly. And the unattractiveness of the head was not helped by its eyes, which were vacuous and black, or the entrails of the organism dangling from the corners of its mouth. Whatever intelligence may have been buried within, It held an overall countenance of retardation.
I'm looking for pink guy.
Frank said. The citrusy organism just stood there, looking at him utterly confused.
Pink guy.
Frank continued in slow speech.
Pink humanoid who is actually a rank and file. Looks pink and sort of like a guy. Oh, God! God! I'm 11! Yeah,
Frank said before mumbling.
this could take a while.
He took a few steps towards Lemon Man.
Listen carefully. I don't have all millennium. I'm looking for P.
Taking his approach as a threat, Lemon Man immediately set upon him with a flurry of blows and a maniacal ripping with razor-sharp teeth.
Oh, God! God! I'm 11!
Was all Frank could hear screaming at him as his head was buried in the ground. He rolled back over to defend himself, kicking, occasionally punching, but the Lemon Man was too quick and too powerful. Again and again, Frank received the hard end of a warty lemon in the face. Over and over it was pounded into his mouth, his eyes, and for good measure, his groin, all to the accompanying sound of an animal in great distress. Frank was done. He had nothing left to fight this creature off. As the brown skies above him were about to dim to gray, he saw another white sharp drop from a tree above him onto the Lemon Man. The new white creature planted itself firmly on Lemon Man's shoulder and began to shout and holler as the Lemon Man tried eagerly to throw the creature from him. The two of them formed a singular, staggering, screaming beast, the white and yellow one on the bottom, bucking and convulsing in terrible distress, and the white and green one on the top, holding on for dear life and calling out in an entirely different dialect.
Yes!
He called in a most triumphant but still cautious manner.
Yes!
Frank sat up with an acute desire to have his eyesight and hearing checked. He had no idea what to make of this flurry of white and yellow and green, and this cacophony of lemons and yes. Eventually, the Lemon Man was able to free himself from the green and white creature and ran off sour and sore. Frank's savior watched him flee before turning to Frank and helping him up. An odd-looking entity, he appeared unnervingly like a humanoid salamander. His body was slimy and white, while his head took a green amphibious form. Frank opened his mouth to thank him for coming to his rescue, but was cut off with a facepalm. Immediately, the creature then produced, seemingly from nowhere, a recorder, placed it firmly in his left nostril, and began to play a rousing rendition of an ancient tune.
Ah, a cultured man.
Said Frank when he had finished the tune.
I guess you're here to help me and not hate me?
Yes.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yes.
Listen, I wonder if you can help me. That was beautiful, by the way. I wonder if you can play a few Oom-Papa tunes for me later on.
The Salamander Man looked perplexed, but continued to give his attention.
I'm looking for Pink Guy. You haven't by any chance seen him?
Yes.
He replied, shaking his head. Frank was beginning to speak the guy's language.
Well, would you mind help me look for him? I don't know my way around here, and I'd hate to come across Lemon Man on my own.
Yes.
Frank somehow understood to this mean, Lemon Man is not a bad guy. You just scared the shit out of him, that's all. The two of them walked out of the waters and along the dry shoreline, between the muddy banks of the mangrove to their left and the hazy fields to their right.
I'm Frank, by the way.
Said Frank, checking his cranium and his testicles for injuries. It was an odd series of gestures to accompany an introduction.
Yes.
He was going to explain where he'd come from and why, but stopped, realizing this would be an impossible task, if not a risky one, given the turn of events so far. They hadn't walked much further when they heard, off in the distance, the faint sound of a caterwaul. They hastened toward it, and as they drew nearer, they could hear just how intense the howling was. Some creature was in terrible agony, and Frank could only hope it was Lemon Man. The screaming came from a cluster of trees in front of a large rock formation. Frank ran toward it with Salamander Man galloping right behind him. Approaching it, Frank was able to see what he had been hearing, and it filled him with horror. They had found Pink Guy. Still kicking and screaming, he had been noosed from the highest branch of a tree. Only this clearly wasn't the common hanging of a common land. Shadows passed in and out of his eyes and nose and ears and mouth, and with each entering and exiting, he shivered in pain and fright. Not an orifice was left untouched, nor a fear left unstoked. The rope choked the breath out of him as the shadows violated his spirit. Pink Guy completely lost his coloring. Salamander Man was up the tree in a flash and produced, again seemingly from nowhere, a knife with which he cut the rope. Frank caught him as he fell, lay him on the ground, and removed the noose from him. It took some time for Pink Guy to regain his composure. Salamander Man reproduced his recorder and began to play a soothing tune which cut through the stilling air. As he did, the shadows retreated and a spirit of calm returned.
What took you so long?
He eventually asked Frank.
Well, Lemon Man, that's what.
Lemon Man.
Said Pink Guy with a knowing nod. He was familiar with the lemon folk.
He can be a real pain in the ass.
He turned and saw Frank's new friend.
Hey, Salamander Man.
He said, cheering up.
Haven't seen you for a while?
Is this guy safe?
Frank asked Pink Guy, pointing to Salamander Man.
Absolutely. Trust me on this. I can sense it.
Indeed, Pink Guy's ability to sense the good and evil in creatures was one of his defining traits, and a reason that he had been chosen to bring revelation to Frank.
Yes.
Immediately, Salamander Man had his recorder in his hand, shoved it into his left nostril again, and began playing his favorite tune. It was beautiful. For a short while there, everything felt right with the Omniverse, and Frank was happy.
Okay, what do we do now?
We lay low.
Pink Eye returned. He was back to full cognition now.
We have to stay here until your chromosomes are fully replenished, and then we look at getting you an audience with a higher power. I suggest we make for the woods, along the foothills, and use their cover.
Everyone was in agreement, so they forged a track through the long grass of the fields and didn't stop till they were in the shade of the trees and sipping water from a pond. Frank reclined by the still waters.
Now this is more like it. I've had quite enough of lemons and nooses and being growed by embryos.
Pink Eye was tempted to ask about the embryos, but knew better than that.
Don't be fooled, Frank.
He said. Frank looked at him.
It's in the quiet oases that the greatest perils lie. Always be vigilant, Frank. Always be on the watch.
What, are you clinically impressive or something, Pink Eye?
He'd forgotten that Pink Eye, just a few moments ago, had been hanging from a tree and tormented by demons.
Can't you let a guy enjoy a quiet moment?
Enjoy it while you still can, Frank.
Pink Eye said, but there was more than a hint of resignation in his voice. Before he finished speaking, there was a loud rustle from a shrub behind him, and a brown creature sprang out and cried, "Be all!" Frank jumped up and immediately spooned Pink Eye.
Who is this and what does he want?
Frank whispered in his ear in a way that was much more creepy than concerned. The creature in front of them was another humanoid, brown from head to foot, except for an enormous black afro on his head, black sunglasses, and a huge set of white choppers in his mouth. He looked very happy to see these three visitors. "The buy-up for jumpin' happy," he said.
I'm sorry.
Said Frank, sitting up and releasing Pink Eye.
My filter's acting up. Could you say that again?
"Ah," he said with a chuckle. "If without or a buckle so likely," he said, before breaking into a tremendous cackle. Clearly, he was having a wonderful time. "Can up the heath for the soil," he added, ribbing Salamander Man in the chest.
Yes.
Said Salamander Man.
What is this guy talking about?
Asked Frank.
He's a balderdash.
Said Pink Guy.
A rank and file of small intellect but enormous charm.
The creature stood there beaming.
But no one has any idea what they are going on about.
I'm balderdash.
Said Frank. "So the last," said the brown one. He was thrilled.
Does he have a name?
Said Pink Guy.
But even if he does, we wouldn't understand what he was telling us. I suspect he can understand us, but we can't follow him.
Far too the lucky but cheese and excited.
Yes. Yes.
Salamander Man chirped in.
You understand balderdash?
Frank asked him. He was starting to enjoy this communion.
Yes.
So you're both retards.
He turned to the newest entity in their troop.
Brown guy, turd man. Sir, do you have a name?
Ha ha ha. The brown one replied. "A pus bucket to inflame." No creature had ever looked prouder of himself. Salamander Man turned to Frank.
Yes.
What did he say, Frank?
Asked Pink Guy.
He said his name is Negi Generation 4.
I have to admit,
Said Pink Guy, reflecting to Frank.
I never would have guessed that.
Kind of odd for a name, don't you think?
He whispered back to Pink Guy.
How do you say your name again?
He asked Negi Generation 4.
In your language, I want to speak your lingo.
Blonde muscles of under and coughing.
He said. He was bouncing on the balls of his feet and pissing himself with joy.
Yes.
Salamander Man confirmed in his language.
But that's not what he said before.
Frank was genuinely baffled.
Hence a bladerdash.
Said Pink Guy, reclining back down beside the pond. They spent the rest of the afternoon catching their supper and the evening roasting it over an open flame. Frank recalled stories of Okinawa, slightly embellished for the telling, which Pink Guy occasionally interrupted with calls of cock and bull. Salamander Man played his flute whenever there was a lull in the conversation, which was rare because Negi Generation 4 talked virtually non-stop, pausing only to laugh at his own, rather fabulous eccentricities. Indeed, Negi Generation's delightful chuckling was the last thing Frank heard before falling into most pleasant sleep he'd had since childhood. When he woke in the morning, the sky above him was a pale yellow, and the higher foliage around him moved with the gentlest of breezes. The others were still sleeping by the remains of a fire that continued to smolder, and a few small creatures were docilely picking at what was left of their meal from the night before. Yet all around them, on the floor of the forests, on the canopies of the shrubs and the branches of the trees, sat ever so delicately a sea of translucent spheres ranging in size from grape to watermelon. Despite the frivolity of the previous night and the peace he had found in the present company, Frank was gripped with alarm at the sight of these bubble-like apparitions. He rapped Pink Guy on the foot. On walking, he immediately sat bolt upright and stared at the phenomena, deeply troubled by it. His movement caused the others to wake, and soon they were looking in bewilderment at this sea of enormous suds surrounding them. All were disturbed by it, except for Negi Generation 4. He was promptly strutted over to one and picked it up.
A stein with the Jollibee.
With that, he opened his mouth wide and threw it in. He swallowed, his eyes sparkled, and then he let out a hearty burp.
What did he say, Salamander Man?
Frank asked. Salamander Man, not sure if he had heard correctly, stuttered out his answer. He said breakfast is served. Cackled the brown one before picking up one of the larger bubbles and sucking it slowly out of shape into his mouth. He cried.
For the frisk.
He said, began Salamander Man.
Yeah, we get it.
Said Frank, cutting him off. He ventured over and lifted one of the opaque spheres from a leaf, sniffled it, and then popped it into his mouth.
Hey,
He said after savoring.
that's pretty good. Sort of like a sticky strawberry gel, but with a touch of honey.
He licked his teeth and gums.
Not bad at all.
The others all promptly tucked into the servings on offer and enjoyed every moment of it. It was only Pink Guy, apparently, who had a moment of angst with the meal, having misfortune to suck in a bubble that he said tasted rather like dog feces. He added very quickly that he had never actually tried dog feces, but that if he had, that is the taste sensation he would very much have expected. His other circular jellies, as he called them, were very much to his liking, especially the largest one he consumed, which he said reminded him of caramel ice cream. They feasted on these treats until they could feast no more, which was rather timely because as the dome above them heated to a burnt gold color, the bubbles melted into the ground, sustaining the plant life, until none remained at all. The days passed like this, yet it was unclear to any of them how long the days were and how many days or months or years they had been there. They simply existed, as though in their own ageless sphere. Frank asked Pink Guy why this was so.
Time is relative in the omniverses, differing from realm to realm and from dimensions to dimensions, affected also by the total number of chromosomes present in any region.
He said.
When the Peace Lords gathered, for instance, there was such a massive abundance of chromosomes that time in that realm dominated the time in any other realm. It's not that time moved more quickly or slowly, but simply that it was dominant over the time specs of other realms and dimensions. By the contrast, in realms where chromosomes were in scant supply, time was inferior to that of just about any other realm about it.
In this environment, Frank had no idea how much his own chromosomes had been multiplying.
So you can grow chromosomes faster?
Pink Guy continued.
In regions where time is dominant, but you do so at your own risk because there are a greater number of higher tier entities there. The strong get stronger.
It was an uncharacteristically warm morning, possibly a Thursday in other realms, when Negi Generation 4 strolled over to Frank, slapped him on the back, and with an enormous guffaw said,
Tonsils go by the stave to fry, and why not?
Absolutely clueless as to what he had just said, Frank returned to slap on the back and laughed along hard with him.
So the donkey and Kylie the mess.
He said, trying to speak the Negi's language. At that very moment, the balderdash suddenly fell to the ground as rigid as a pole on an icy day. Frank wondered what on earth it was that he had said to make him stiffen like that.
All I said was,
But he could no longer remember what it was that he had said.
Go up the mountain.
Negi said. Shocked, Frank, Pink Guy, and Salamander Man gathered around him.
I understood him.
Frank said, perplexed.
He said, go up the mountain.
Go up the mountain.
The Negi repeated in the same mechanical voice.
Negi!
Shouted Pink Guy, slapping Negi in the face as hard as he could.
Snap out of it! Snap out of it!
What's wrong?
Frank asked him. He grabbed him by the shoulders and began to shake him violently.
Come on, Negi, snap out of it, son.
Negi Generation 4 lay completely seized up on the ground.
Go up the mountain.
He said again. The three other entities stared at each other. Suddenly, an entirely different vibe possessed them. Laughter, peace, and levity were replaced with somberness, fear, and gravity.
Go up the mountain.
Came the same cold command. Negi began to convulse. It was just a quiver at first, but it grew quickly into fully fledged convulsion till he looked like a fish flopping about on dry land. With the spasms came a torrent of the same directives.
Go up the mountain. Go up the mountain. Go up the mountain.
He was screeching like a possessed man, and then he stopped. At first, the others felt quite sure he was dead. There was no movement, no breathing, no life. They slowly squatted around him and prepared to give him a solemn farewell. Frank was about to poke him in the cheek to see if it could elicit any response, but before he could, Negi Generation 4 sat up on his elbows, flashed his smile, and declared,
Pacing neither with oil or not.
"He wants to know why you're all staring at him," Salamander Man translated. It was clear to the others that Negi had no idea what had just transpired. Frank paused before answering.
We're just looking at a very handsome fellow.
He said.
Book off for under the grouse.
He replied, bouncing on his toes again.
Oh, the yet.
Absolutely, my friend, just what I was going to say.
Frank encouraged him. Yet, the command that had been incessantly repeated during Negi's missing minutes was not lost on Frank, Pink Guy, and Salamander Man. Their discussion on the matter was a mere formality. They knew they had to ascend the mountain, they just had no idea why. Negi couldn't understand why the three were so determined to make the climb, but as long as they were all together, he was happy enough. The day was still young when they started off. None of them had gone up the mountain before, so they were complete novices when it came to its terrain. Yet the mountain was, for the most part, even and without treacherousness. As such, they made good progress. The morning events continued to weigh on their minds, so there was little discussion between them as they climbed. Negi Generation 4 picked up on this, and he too remained uncharacteristically quiet. Walking in single file and with their eyes fixed toward the summit, none of them noticed the swarm of creatures coming out of the swamplands and mudflats and woodlands following them up the slopes. It was Pink Guy who first sensed their presence.
We're being followed?
He said, without turning around to see them. They all paused and sat on a ledge to rest and looked back down the mountain. There, while still at a considerable distance, was a multitude of creatures, great and small. Predominantly brute beasts, but also some other rank and files, and possibly some from the higher tiers. Their numbers couldn't be counted. They covered the foothills like pebbles on a beach. They stopped when the four rank and files stopped, and continued when they continued. They retreated when the rank and files turned towards them, and advanced irresistibly when they turned away. Sitting on a gentle rocky ledge surveying the distant mangroves below, Pink Guy explained this happening to the others.
It's you, Frank.
All three looked at the Okinawan.
They sense it, Frank, that your chromosomes are multiplying at unprecedented rates. They can feel it. It's rare that entities not of this realm pass through here, but they have never sensed from anyone what they are sensing from you.
This seemed so ridiculous to Frank that he was ready to dismiss it outright, but he had no other explanation for what was happening, so kept his thoughts to himself for the time being. More creatures began emerging from the trees and grasslands.
The more I see what's happening in and around you, Frank, the more I worry.
Pink Guy said.
And the more we need to take care.
He added with caution.
You are what this world might consider royalty.
Too minty in the underavout.
Negi said, in a much more sullen voice than they were used to hearing.
If we stay together, we'll all be fine.
Pink Guy assured them he was lying. He looked out over the landscape.
The tiers are changing.
He recalled in a still voice.
We should move on.
On turning back to face the mountain, they were startled to see a hideous creature just a stone's throw from them. A reptilian humanoid, he was a fearful sight. His head was singed, a rusty distortion of what it had once been, and its torso and upper limbs were burned beyond usefulness. Scorched flesh hung and dripped from its body in large chunks. But its most terrible trauma was to the lower half of its body, a charred mess of staggering legs, exposed organs, and twisted tail. He stumbled towards them. "Come with me," he moaned. None of them moved. "Come with me," he said again, gesturing with what was perhaps his only functioning limb. The wind picked up as he spoke and blew his stench toward them. It was Negi who took the first step.
No!
Called Pink Guy, and Negi stepped back in line with the others.
He's condemned. He's soon to be one of the wretched, and he wants us to save him. But we can't. If we go with him, we risk being condemned ourselves. Have nothing to do with him.
Pink Eye turned and headed up the mountain at a brisk pace, with the others all following in like manner, leaving the condemned creature to his morbid fate. At this point, they were more than halfway up the mountain, and the summit came into view. Yet as it did, the gusts of wind grew stronger, the sky began to gray, a phenomena they had never seen in that place before. And clouds began to form, also something they had never previously seen there. They pressed on. The higher they climbed, the fiercer the winds became, the thicker the clouds were, and the blacker the sky grew. Each of them were aware, if not terrified, of the ominous implications of this atmosphere, yet they each knew, without doubt, they had to scale the summit. Frank hoped that somehow in reaching the top, they would have satisfied some cosmic requirement and everything would return to normal. Pink Eye suspected entirely more nefarious. Salamander Man and Negi generation simply had that feeling that they were way out of their depth. By the time they reached the summit, it was completely shrouded in dark clouds. The wind blew in flurries, peals of thunder began to echo about them, and a smell of burning filled the air. Atmospheric conditions aside, there was a creepiness which none of them could source yet, which they all sensed vividly, sulfuric stench which sickened them. It caused them to pull apart and observe each other with a hint of suspicion. Time stood still there on the mountaintop, an eerie emptiness in the midst of a storm. But that was it. The four entities looked at one another, unsure what to make of it all. They had satisfied the mystic command through Negi Generation 4 to go up the mountain, and they had experienced some highly unusual phenomena on the mountaintop, but there seemed to be little more to it than that.
Yes!
What do we do now? Salamander Man eventually asked.
Do we just go back down?
It was more of a suggestion than a question from Frank. No one responded. They continued to wait, looking about them and wandering on the spot like kids lost in a canyon. Pink Eye was about to suggest they return to the foothills when a swirl of dark clouds lowered before them on the very pinnacle of the mountain, not a tree length from them. The clouds slowed to a majestic stillness before parting to a dark figure descending on a cushion of gray clouds that delivered him like a royal visitation. In the parting mountaintop air, they could see without any restriction the manifestation before them, and it was one of the fearful ugliness. Every aspect of his presence, from his physical appearance to his spiritual disposition, proclaimed a sickening hideousness. Before him, leashed with heavy chains, were two small but ferocious minions. They lashed out indiscriminately, clawing and leaping, snarling and drooling and hungry for blood. As the cloud settled on the ground, the central creature squirmed and then rolled forth into a couch position. Then it moved toward them. The four climbers could sense nothing but outright fear. Frank felt a stabbing pain down the side of his neck. His face turned a ghostly shade of gray, and though it was cool, he began to sweat uncontrollably. The creature moved in awkward ticks, slowly at first, but occasionally in bursts, and in a line that would normally be associated with the stagger of a drunkard. Crab-like, it approached them, and though they drew back, it was upon them, right before them, and within them. Terror seized each of them, tried to flee. Their feet remained locked firmly to the ground. All the creatures that had been following them up the mountain had no such impositions placed upon them and scattered as soon as they saw presence. It was Pink Eye who first uttered the words. The whole sky lit up as he said it in one enormous lightning bolt that seemed to forget to flash back off again. The light from it revealed his appearance in its fullness, not least of all his eyes, which stitched together, yet seemed to be looking in all directions at once. His face twitched again as he looked up at Frank with a mixture of longing and detestation. The words gave Frank a tingling paralysis in his spine. The Peace Lord's face twitched again as he considered Frank. He repeated. There was a curious, perhaps mystical connection between Frank and Lord Chin Chin that neither of them could identify, and that disturbed both. But it did mean that Frank could understand Chin Chin's language without any misconceptions, where the other three only heard. Repeatedly, Frank heard a language ancient and complex, powerful and innate, and he responded in kind. I have come for you, Frank heard the Dark Lord speak. His voice had a piercing authority and a childish whine. Initially, Frank remained speechless, horrified to his core, but as Chin Chin repeated his claim, Frank found his voice.
What do you want from me?
You dare to speak to me without me asking you to? He looked incensed at this. Have you no respect for higher powers? Have you no idea who I am and what I am capable of?
What do you want with me?
Frank asked again. The Dark Lord convulsed with rage at this. There were more peals of thunder and rain pelted against Frank's face. You speak when I tell you to speak? The words came out like exercise spirits. His face suddenly jerked as though receiving a fresh inspiration. You don't fear me, he said, sickened by the thought of it. Oh, you're afraid of me, but you don't fear me. He looked up at Frank, who, to the relief of others, commanded his full attention. Fear comes from knowledge, he said, giving Frank an education. Knowledge of good and evil, knowledge of one's true place in this life, and knowledge that I am God. The last word spewed out, and as he said it, it reverberated around the mountain. With it, he cast his arm powerfully toward Negi Generation 4, instantly decapitating him and knocking his lifeless body down the slopes of the mountain. Pink Guy and Salamander Man reeled back in horror at the sight of this. Never in their lives they seen such wanton disregard for innocent life. Frank watched the body slide down the rock face before shrugging.
I quite liked him.
Frank thought.
What a say.
Do I have your fear now? Chin Chin asked him. Frank remained in silent terror. I came here to kill you, Frank. He paused for effect. I don't like you. I despise you. I have in my very soul an intense desire to hurt you. I want you to feel all the pain of the omniverses. I want you to suffer like no one else has ever suffered before. I want your name to become synonymous with unspeakable pain. Frank already felt halfway there. But I won't, Frank. If it were possible, there was a slight softening in his voice. I have other plans for you. Frank gave his full attention. The other two had no idea what he was saying. You have an impressive rate of increase in your chromosomes, Frank. And the rate is increasing. This makes you useful. So I will give you the honor of allowing you to make a deal with me. I will return you back to your human world and allow you to live and relatively free of pain. And in return, you will give me your chromosomes. What sayest thou? Which do you choose, Frank? Eternal suffering of the highest order or an obscure life without excessive chromosomes? His face ticked again as if it functioned as punctuation. Though eternal suffering of the highest order was clearly not the choice to make, Frank lamented the miserable option that the other choice left him. And so, with sad resignation, he said,
I'll give you my chromosomes.
I want to hear it again, the Dark Lord said.
I will give you my chromosomes.
Frank repeated. Very well. When I leave here, it will be with your chromosomes. And I will be transporting you to a secret place far from here where you can replenish your chromosomes in relative peace and quiet, and where I can find you anytime. Is that understood?
Yes.
Frank said solemnly. After I have left, go back down the mountain. Your transport will be complete before you get to the bottom. With that, the Dark Lord Chin Chin crawled back to the pinnacle of the mountain and curled into a ball. The wind picked up once again, thunder and lightning cracked, and hailstones the size of limes fell all about them. Dark clouds slowly enveloped him, and then he was gone. Very quickly, the clouds dissipated, the weather cleared, and the sky returned to its golden glow. The three remaining rank and files came together, observed Negi Generation 4's remains for a while, and then headed back down the mountain. Physically, the trek down was somehow more difficult than the one up. Psychologically and spiritually, they were all changed entities for the mountaintop experience, and as they descended, Frank shared with Pink Guy the conversation he had with Chin Chin. When he had finished, Pink Guy stopped and looked at Frank with a hint of relief on his face.
I wonder.
His voice trailed off there.
Miles.
Asked Frank.
I can't be sure,
He thought some more. Frank waited as a gust of wind blew between them.
but I suspect that Chin Chin might not be God.
You could have fooled me.
Frank returned.
Oh, he's powerful. He can control atmospheric conditions and he can take life, but he's not God.
How can you be so sure?
What he does is the work of a peace lord. God
Pink Guy paused to find the right words.
wouldn't need your chromosomes.
Frank wasn't sure whether to be relived or more anxious at hearing this. Yet the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The further down the mountain they travailed, the better they all felt, until halfway down, when a spirit of utter levity came upon them all. Salamander Man produced his recorder and began to play a sprightly tune. Pink Guy actually began to skip along as he played. As they drew nearer to the foothills, just above a series of steep cliffs, there was a sudden powerful earthquake. The whole mountain seemed to bend and start cracking. Holding on to a sharp rock ledge for dear life, Frank's forearm was cut from wrist to elbow, and then the three of them were tossed from their thin ledge and fell bouncing and flopping down the cliffs. They landed together in a circle of blood, broken and cut and bleeding and torn, groaning and moaning and screaming and cussing. Egg-sized rocks and boulders the size of large dinosaurs fell on them till they were buried under a small mountain that rose from the foothills like an altar to a deity. When the dust had settled, there was nothing left alive in that higher than a brute beast.